Hello, everyone. Oh, God. So now we have the daunting task to be swashbuckling. That is not something
That literally
to live
no
up
one
to.
has ever called me swashbuckling or anything that's ever been associated with me.
I'm sorry.
Before that review.
Yeah, well, now you have it.
Can I just say one thing with regard to Derek's book? I was taking I did an event last night in D.C. and I was taking the train down. And I was reading a galley of this book, and it's a terrific book. So look for it in February. And as we were getting off the train, people are getting their baggage and everything off out of the overhead compartments, and this guy kind of looks at me and kind of puzzled expression and kind of leans forward, and then he says, "I'm sorry. Can I just bother you for 1 second?" And I'm like, "Yes, I am the host of that PBS series that you love, Steven Johnson." And he's like, "How did you come to be reading Derek's book?" And it was one of his colleagues from the Atlantic. So it's already people are buzzing about it on the Acela. So it's obviously on
that Acela crowd. Awesome. To start, the thesis of this book, I think, is really profound, and it's profound because most history books about economics and about innovation, they focus on what you might call, the serious stuff, the steak and potatoes, militaries and leaders and presidents and elections, and the sort of subtly subversive thesis of this book is that the future is actually made not in the steak, but in the candy, in people having fun, and then their idle fun somehow leading over across centuries and between accidents to quote-unquote serious innovations that really change our lives. And the way that you tell the story, I think, most convincingly is sort of your long scope on cotton. So can you talk to us a little bit first about sort of your thesis of how of play as it involves cotton and the Industrial Revolution?
Yeah. So the argument of the book is it's when you think about the prime movers of history, like what really drives history, what you learned in high school or in college when you studied history, that list you would make of military conquest or religious belief or tribalism or nationalism or the quest for power or wealth accumulation. All those things are true. It's not that those forces aren't profound ones. It's just that there's this other force that is often kind of fragmented out in lots of kind of footnotes and kind of sidebars on the kind of macro story of history. But when you look at them all together, when you look at the collection of things that people did just for the fun of it, for the delight of it, or the sense of wonder that something inspired, those kind of practices or kind of frivolous pursuits end up being much more influential than we realize. And so there's a chapter in the first chapter really of the book is about the history of fashion and shopping. And there was this very interesting thing that started to happen in London in the 1670s and 1680s, which is that a new kind of store began to appear on the streets of kind of well-to-do neighborhoods in London. And up until that point, shopping experiences had been pretty functional, right? There were these arcades that had developed earlier that century, but mostly you would just go into these very streamlined environments or, kind of traveling fairs and things like that, and you would barter, and you would have, whoever was selling whatever they're selling, they had a big rack of all the stuff they were selling, and you would buy it, and that would be it. And suddenly in the 1660s, 1670s, 1680s, these new stores started to appear that were incredibly lavish. And they had beautiful curtains and kind of faux fireplaces and kind of beautiful couches and rugs and so on. And they were just unnecessarily ornate. And a lot of people commenting on them at the time, particularly men, were baffled by why these tradesmen were wasting all this money making their stores look so nice. Like Daniel Defoe wrote these kind of confused pieces about like what it doesn't make any sense. Why don't you just sell your goods as efficiently as possible? Why waste anything and making the space look fancy? And it turned out now, to our eyes, we understand that what was happening was that shopping was becoming its own kind of form of amusement, its own kind of recreational act. And having the experience in this envelope of luxury made it even more exciting. And what was being passed on in those new shops was a taste for this exotic new fabric from India, calico and chintz, cotton. And calico and chintz were unique, partially because they were cotton, so it was an unusually soft fabric, but also they had these beautiful, delightful patterns that would survive being washed multiple times, which was a real innovation in and of itself. And partially people loved the patterns, they loved the kind of visual imagery of the patterns, but they also would wear cotton for the first time as underwear, which was a big breakthrough because everyone wore wool underwear up until that point. And you can imagine London, rainy, kind of cold London with wool underwear was not that great. So
or July,
people,
right.
Yeah, or anytime, really. And so all of a sudden this craze for calico and chintz sweeps through England among well-to-do women, and all of these things happen. The East India Company starts making an immense amount of money, a huge trade imbalance opens up with India, but maybe most importantly, it devastates the traditional wool industry in England. And so all these traditional kind of laborers and wool producers are outraged, and there's massive political backlash against these women, a very kind of gendered political backlash against these women who are shamed for betraying their kind of patriotic cause with these exotic foreign fabrics. And so they're called calico madams. And there are these pamphlets and plays and poems, hundreds of these things are written about these terrible women. And in a sense, what starts to develop is a kind of make England's wool industry great again movement, if you want to describe it like that. And for a while, calico and chintz are actually banned because they're destroying the English economy. But of course, at the same time, what also happens is a separate group of people, entrepreneurs and engineers, started thinking, well, wait a second, we could maybe use some new technology to make cotton and fabrics like calico and chintz here on British soil, and we can do it with this advanced new technology that's powered by steam. And that really is the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, arguably the most important technological change in the history of our species. And so if you ask yourself, like, what caused industrialization? The traditional story is that it's driven by these, ingenious entrepreneurs and engineers who come up with this fancy technology. But in fact, it really starts with this moment of kind of delight and fascination with this new fabric from somewhere across the world. And then it spirals out into those big traditional historical stories.
Right. And it's interesting because my book, which gets at a lot of the same ideas but never quite overlaps, so yes, you can buy both of them and have no overlapping material, there's a chapter called The Birth of Fashion, in which I say, all right, well, when you're trying to ask, why does a cultural product succeed, you always have to account for a few factors. You have to account for price. Some things succeed because they're cheap. You have to account for scarcity, for economics. Sometimes things succeed because people are feeling very rich. But there is one cultural product that has no price, that has absolute infinite choice, and yet still clearly follows hype cycles. It gets hot, and then people sort of cool on it. And that cultural product is something everyone in this room has, a first name. First names get hot, and then they cool down. When you meet someone named Ethel or Edna, you immediately have, or not meet them, you hear about a woman named Ethel or Edna, and you immediately have a sense of how old that person is, which is vary. You meet someone named, Noah or Dylan. These are very popular names for young boys. And so I investigate this. There's a really interesting sociological explanation of why does this happen with first names? If there's no price and there's no scarcity, and it's essentially like shopping at an infinity store where you can buy anything that you want, why do they still have hype cycles? And the answer goes back to the Industrial Revolution, in fact. For the vast majority of human history, first names were not a fashion. They were a custom. The British monarchs all had the same first names. That's why you had to have Henry VIII and Edward IV, and they just recycled the same ones over and over, and the only way you know the difference is the Roman numerals after the name. Half of all the men in the Massachusetts Bay Colony were named William, Thomas, or James. Half of all the women had the same three names. Half of all, if you look at Sao Paulo baptismal records from the 1600s, half of all the women only share three names. So names for the vast majority of human history were not a fashion. They were a custom. And then at some point in the 1800s, the turnover rate of first names suddenly goes like this, whoosh. And this happens in Denmark, and it happens in Hungary, and it happens in Brazil, and it happens in Canada and the United States, and all over the world. And so the factor, the motivating variable here has to be something that's shared equally across the world, and it's the Industrial Revolution. And the theory is that essentially when you have all these people with different first names moving to the same area, and then copying each other and distinguishing from each other and saying, oh, Thomas is a farmer boy's name. I don't want the name Thomas. Or James is like this. You're suddenly distinguishing, and you have competition and choice, and it creates these fashion cycles. And so for the last 200 years, first names have very much been a fashion. And it's just interesting because it suggests something that you've written about both in this book and before, which is that something very special happens when people come together. So, there's a magic that happens when you just have lots of people in the same area watching each other and answering each other's sort of stimuli.
And fashion, the explosion of things that become fashionable and things that start to follow the rhythm of fashion. And fashion really accelerates over the course of the 1700s. At the beginning of the 1700s, in terms of dress fashion, the cycles were like every decade. Something would come in a decade and stay fashionable for a decade, and then it would go out, and then another decade's worth of fashions would come in. And by the end of the century, fashion was on the kind of annual cycle that it is to this day. And you can look at that, I think, and say, well, the amount of time people began to spend worrying about whether Noah was a fashionable name, or whether it was out this year, or whether this particular shade of purple is the right shade for this year. You could say, well, that's just a big waste of time when people could be more gainfully employed thinking about bigger problems. But there's also something that fashion introduces that creates a kind of a certain restlessness in a society and a willingness to embrace new ideas or embrace change or an openness to experimentation. You talk in the book about this idea of neophilia and neophobia, like people, openness to new experiences versus being opposed to new experiences. And fashion-forward societies are very, almost to a fault, neophiliac. And Braudel, the great historian, has a line where he says, it may not be a coincidence that the parts of the world that were the first to really undergo democratic revolutions and explore new models of kind of political organization were the ones in which fashion was the most advanced. And this idea, this kind of restlessness and this openness to change eventually kind of migrates into more serious pursuits like how should we govern ourselves and how should society should be structured.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. There's there's a theory called Laver's Law, which essentially says that there is a specific order in which things become fashionable or lack fashion. So if something is 1 year old, it's dowdy. If it's 10 years old, it's sort of chintzy and weird. If it's 30 years old, it becomes nostalgic, and if it's 150 years old, it's beautiful or classic. And so you have this. So fashion is sort of it is neophilic, but it has this interesting catch where new is good and old is bad, but very old is good again. And so you sort of have this renovation of styles. The second chapter of your book that's fascinating is about is a really interesting history of music. I think that's essentially a fair thing to call it. A history of music from the sort of prehistoric pan flute to the modern file swapping computers of the 1990s and 2000s. And maybe talk a little bit about how music has served as a perfect example of this thing where technically nobody has to do it. No one has to sing, no one has to play that pan flute, but somehow in singing and playing the pan flute and trying to share that music, people sometimes accidentally create the most important moments of economic change, like the computer.
One of the things that really influenced me in writing this book, there was a great lecture that Brian Eno gave a couple of years ago, one of the John Peel lectures, and he has this definition of art in that lecture, and he defines art as anything we don't have to do. We have to feed ourselves, we have to keep warm in the winter, but all the other things that we don't have to do, we do just for fun. That's art, that's culture. And so this book is, in a sense, an exploration of that idea, looking at it kind of over the course of history. And music is just a beautiful example. It's a deep, profound mystery of why we are so moved by something as abstract and non-functional as music. And there's been a lot of interesting books written about this. I I really focus in this book on the history of musical instrument design. Just if you think about it, despite the fact it's the most abstract form of art, it has led to the most technological kind of tinkering. There's just the number of musical instruments that have been invented is just vast, and in the digital age, it's there's an entirely new form of instrumentation invented every week practically. And what's interesting is that story of music is actually very intimately and surprisingly tied into the history of computing and the history of computers. So in the book, I talk about this invention, this really extraordinary device that was created in Baghdad over 1,000 years ago by these engineers at an amazing institution in Baghdad called the House of Wisdom, which was kind of a mix of a translation bureau and a think tank and like a maker lab, basically. And this is at the height of the Islamic Golden Age, and they were inventing all these amazing kind of breakthrough engineering technologies, almost all of which took the form of toys. So they were doing amazing hydraulic valves and things like that, all to make these little interesting automated playthings, right? And one of the things that they invented that was almost lost to history, actually, it survived in this other manuscript, that was only discovered about 100 years ago, was a device called the instrument that plays itself. And the instrument was basically a automated flute player. It was actually secretly behind the scenes, it was an organ, a water-powered organ. And what made it so radical is it was powered by this rotating cylinder like you would see in a music box that had little pegs on the cylinder corresponding to the notes that you wanted it to play. And you could swap out the cylinders. If you wanted it to play a different song, you could take it out. You could, what they called, cut a new cylinder, the way people would talk about cutting a record, actually, many years later, and program it to play some new notes and swap that cylinder in, and it would play a totally different song. And this was a really profound idea. This was the beginning. This is the first truly programmable machine. It's this idea that a machine could be designed to be open to other instructions that you could encode in some form and teach it to do new things. And so the whole idea of the opposition between hardware and software becomes kind of imaginable with this instrument. But it's just a musical instrument. It's just a toy, really. And that idea actually stays alive in music for about 600 years. It goes on in the form of music boxes, programmable music boxes, which are kind of fashionable toys for the elite in Europe. And then finally people started to think, well, wait a second, maybe we could use them to program not just music, but maybe we could use it to program patterns in fabric, again, back to the Industrial Revolution. And so that leads to the punch card technique of the Jacquard loom, which was this first programmable loom, and the punch card approach, which revolutionized textile design at that particular moment in time in the early 1900s, early 1800s, led directly to Charles Babbage and the analytical engine, the first truly programmable computer. So when you ask yourself, what were the building blocks that it took to invent a computer? Yes, it was partially the military, and it was partially calculating rocket trajectories and cracking code and things like that. But it was also an automated flute player and weaving beautiful patterns in fabric. That is an absolutely essential part of the story. And if you ignore that part of it, you're not telling the story accurately.
Yeah, my favorite example of music and thinking about music and the way that it inflects, capital S, serious culture and economics and politics is the relationship between music and political rhetoric. So to give you a bit of background, the first musicologist that I talked to for my book is named Diana Deutsch, and she's a musical illusionist. She's a studier of musical illusions. And the most famous musical illusion is called the speech-to-sound illusion. And this is the idea that if I say a sentence and I start repeating it again, start repeating it again, start repeating it again, start repeating it again, you begin to hear da-da-da-da-da-dun, da-da-da-da-da-dun, and you can basically take almost any chaotic sound and repeat it at a common interval, and the brain begins to hear it as music. It stops becoming cacophony, and it starts becoming music. So in many ways, repetition is the God particle of music. You need rhythm to within a song to create a beat. Then you put a chorus over that beat. You repeat the chorus within the song, and if you like the song a lot, you repeat the song, and sometimes it repeats itself inside of your head as an earworm. Repetition is powerful in music in a way it isn't necessarily powerful in storytelling or visual art. It's very special to music. One of my favorite studies from the book is this guy David Huron from Ohio State, who he does this experiment
so cool.
with mice. And he'll say, all right, so you play a note for a mouse. Let's say, call it a B note. You play B, and the mouse turns its adorable little head the way little mouse do. And then you play B again, and the mouse turns its head. Eventually, the mouse will habituate to the sound. He'll get sick of it. It's like, you hear construction noise outside of your window when you're working, and you learn to forget that it's there. So how do you make the mouse turn its head, to keep turning its head? Well, you play a C note, a different note, and the mouse will turn its head. The interesting thing about the C note is that the C note won't just alert the mouse. It'll also dishabituate the mouse from the B note. So now you can go back to distracting the mouse with the B note. So if you want to distract a mouse for the longest period of time with the fewest number of notes, that pattern looks like B, 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 C, B, B, C, B, C, and then a D note to dishabituate from both the B and the C notes. And if you take a little part of that and you just look at the sequence that goes B, B, C, B, C, D, and you replace B with verse, and C with chorus, and D with bridge, you get verse, verse, chorus, bridge, which is essentially the construction of every pop song ever written. So note, all pop music is not just a mouse dishabituation study. That's not the point. The point is that music plays within rules. A line I use a lot in the book is one from Robert Frost. Poetry without rhyme is like playing tennis without a net. Repetition does not give you a #1 Billboard hit. It's merely the net that you have to play around. So what the heck does that have to do with politics? All of Greek political rhetoric is repetition. You have anaphora, which is repetition at the beginning of a sentence. We will fight them in the air, we will fight them on the land, Winston Churchill. You have repetition at the end of a sentence. Abraham Lincoln, government of the people, by the people, for the people. You have diacope, which is the repetition of a word with a few words interjected in the middle to sort of enliven it. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Or simply BCB, Drill Baby Drill, Sarah Palin, the great political rhetorician. But the most popular is antimetaboly. Antimetaboly is everywhere. If you go back and read JFK speeches, and he and Sorensen are considered the great, speech-writing team of the 20th century, antimetaboly goes A, B, B, A. So you can remember it because it spells ABBA, and ABBA wrote a lot of pop song hits. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Hillary Clinton, women's rights are human rights, and human rights are women's rights. It is absolutely everywhere. Bill Clinton used it, Ronald Reagan used it, everybody uses it. And if you go back and you look even at like how to succeed, you back at like old books that do extremely well, like the bestseller list that are like self-help books, almost all the most underlined lines are antimetaboly because it has this wondrous ability to turn just about any idea into music. And when you hear the music of the idea, you're like, oh, well, I really want that to be true, so I'll accept it. I mean, ask not what your country can do for you is actually a crazy idea. Ask not what your country can do for you. Why not? I'm poor. Of course I should ask what my country can do for me. But Sorensen writes it as ABBA, antimetaboly, and we're like, what a beautiful idea about self-sacrifice. So it's fascinating. One of the things that we both sort of look at is this interesting relationship between surprise. The surprise instinct is the name of your conclusion. This search for novelty, which is very much the engine of play. And on the other hand, familiarity. This idea that people do like new things, but maybe they only like the new things that remind them of old things. In what way do you see this as having played out in history and in your book?
Well, it gets to a really interesting point, and I think it's interesting to think about it in terms of the political speech as well, because I actually think that just hearing you run through those phrases, and you do have some, drill, baby drill, and Obama does some of that. But actually, I think they are starting to sound dated to our ears. I feel like that there's a certain kind of political rhetoric, the ask not, certainly the formal structure of ask not. If someone tried to pull that off, that would just wouldn't ring true anymore. And I think, Gingrich apparently said the other day, I saw a quote where he was like, people don't realize that like Trump is actually an incredibly genius orator, and that he has this way of talking that seems incredibly authentic compared to the way that political speeches are normally given, which is a disturbing thought. But I think that I bring this up because I think there is familiarity and surprise are definitely the kind of interesting cocktail that run through all of these things that we're discussing, but they evolve over time, and there's a kind of a generational quality to surprise as well. And that's one of the things that I was wrestling with in that last chapter that you alluded to, which is to say, why is it that so many of these things that have seemed initially to be kind of frivolous and trivial, why have they led to so many interesting new ideas? Why do they keep pushing us to new innovations that change the world? And I think part of the reason is that surprise has to be constantly reinvented. One generation's surprise is the next generation's old man stuff.
But you go back, that it's the definition of fashion, right?
Right.
People
you have
will
to
get
do
sick
something.
of it, and you see it in music, right? Music doesn't sound like it did in the 1980s. The music doesn't sound like it did in the 1990s. It's constantly, even though hip hop is clearly the sort of hegemonic power of sort of music genre right now, it blends with country, and then it takes a bit from dubstep, and then it takes a bit from the new Childish Gambino album is very much like 80s and 1970s soul, and so it's constantly finding new ways to click forward in terms of surprise.
Yeah, interestingly about music, melody and harmony do not seem to change that much. There seems to be pop music. That's our timer saying that we want to turn it over to questions soon. But where music seems to advance, so the chord progressions really aren't all that different. You don't see nearly as much experimentation as you would think. Where it does change is rhythmic patterns and timbre. Timbre is the big thing that happens in pop music. Is that it's still a 1-4-5 progression. 50 years later, the chords are the same as the chords that Elvis Presley was playing or the Who were playing. What's changed is the sonic properties of the sound are constantly being reinvented and stuff like that. And so you need to kind of continue to experiment, and that forces you to invent new instruments, and that forces you to invent new kinds of sounds to excite the ear in a new way, and that then leads you to other technological breakthroughs that don't necessarily have to do with music.
And this is so obviously true for storytelling as well. Joseph Campbell had his Hero of a Thousand Faces and presented this theory that basically every epic story is the same story. It's always the lost, ordinary individual who's in the real world, who enters the supernatural world, who fails and then succeeds, and fails and succeeds, and then finally defeats the person who is somehow attached to his own past and comes back into the real world, out of the supernatural world, as the hero. It's Harry Potter, it's Lord of the Rings, it's Jesus, it's Buddha, it's so many different stories. And so on the one hand, a book publisher reading Harry Potter at first might think like, oh, not the Jesus story again. But the point is that we enjoy a bit of predictability. We enjoy a bit of familiarity, provided that the artist changes the timbre, sort of loosely defined as, it's not religion, it's magic. It's not Middle Earth. It's some weird, bizarro England. And so this idea actually becomes very interesting when you look at a show like Westworld, which is sort of trying to go meta on a lot of these ideas. And when you read Wonderland, particularly its first few chapters, it's the introduction actually, I think, that you can't not think while reading it, did the producers of Westworld read this book before they made the show? Yeah. Because you talk about sort of how whenever human beings have the capacity to be creative and to play, they design themselves. They design automaton versions of themselves to play with. So to talk a little bit about sort of the history of this weird species narcissism that we have and sort of the serious implications.
Well, there are two ways that Westworld is interesting here. One, the way you talk about it in the book, but I just want to say, building on what we were just talking about, the argument that you need to continue to kind of ramp up the element of surprise, and that one generation's surprise is the next generation's kind of too familiar, is actually directly related to the way that Westworld is structured, and connects back to a book I wrote a million years ago called Everything Bad is Good for You, which had made the argument that slowly over time, television shows were getting more complicated in terms of the plot structures, in terms of the number of characters, in terms of the amount they were willing to challenge the audience compared to the shows that I grew up watching, like Dallas or The Dukes of Hazzard or The Love Boat. And Westworld is a fantastic. I mean, there was some little meme I saw the other day online that was like, I watched Westworld I have no idea what is happening. You know, that kind of feeling that you get when you watch these shows. They're unbelievable. I mean, if you just diagram what is happening in Westworld.
No one said that about Dallas.
Yeah, no one said
Dallas is way too confusing.
And actually, I used to make people watch the first minute of episode 8 of season 1 of Dallas, just to remind people of how condescending television used to be. There was a whole scene where literally it's like the creators are sitting there going, "These two people are brothers. Did you get this?"
CBS is still airing, so yeah.
So that's part of it. It's just the complexification of the storytelling, because the surprising, the kind of the need to surprise us requires more complex stories, because we've gotten to be good at parsing those stories, which is an interesting whole question. But also with Westworld, I think there's a profound, important question. I think we're going to be wrestling with a lot faster than we think, that Westworld brings up and that the book brings up. And it actually brings up in the context of there's a riff in the book about the creation of Snow White and Disney. And one of the things that happened, they innovated so quickly in coming up with Snow White. I mean, and the art of animation between Steamboat Willie and Snow White is just this incredible leap forward. And as the Disney team and Disney himself were working on this project, they had this moment about halfway through it where they thought, you know, this is so lifelike. I wonder if people will actually cry at these animated characters, which seemed preposterous. If you'd ever seen, you know, Steamboat Willie, you would never think anybody would ever cry about that. It was just this kind of silly, like, flipbook style drawing. And then, in fact, when Snow White was screened, there were audible sobs in the auditorium.
Charlie Chaplin called it the best movie he'd ever seen.
Yeah, and so somehow, just with this a certain frames per second, certain sound, certain quality of animation, you could take entirely like drawn characters and make people feel this incredibly intense feeling of emotion. And I think that is where we were headed very quickly with simulated beings. Westworld is obviously projecting this, you know, kind of far in the future, but I think our ability to be fooled into forming emotional attachments with things that are not alive, we are far more vulnerable to that illusion than we realize. We experience it now in the sense of we watch the Kardashians and we feel like we know the Kardashians, but the Kardashians are, as far as we know, actual human beings. Somewhere they exist in the world. But I think when you see, and this will probably happen first with voice, with things like Alexa, not my wife who's named Alexa, but the Amazon Alexa or Siri, when these voice agents actually begin to get to know us and learn a little bit about us and develop some kind of personalized connection to us, it will be almost impossible for us not to form interesting, complex, layered, potentially even romantic, as in the movie Her, attachments to these disembodied, non-existent creatures. Just as we can't not see anything projected at more than 12 frames per second as continuous motion, even though it's not, it's just an illusion. There's something in our visual system that just must see that as motion. I think we are going to get to that much faster than we realize. It won't be a question of AI and superintelligence and killer robots from the future. Siri will not be conscious at all at that stage, but we will feel this compulsive need to project consciousness onto Siri, and that will be pretty creepy and interesting.
Fall in love with the robot overlords.
Right, exactly.
Not just welcome them.
Way before yeah, exactly. It's easy to just welcome.
We have allotted some time for questions, and we have a microphone that's going to be walked around. As we search for the first question, I was just going to say that in terms of the history of television, how it's gone from unbelievably simple, stupid to possibly even too complex. One of the sort of toys that may have played a role there is the laugh track, which Charles Douglas devised in the 1950s. He essentially, there was a problem because if we're actors on a stage and we're doing some 1950s show when TV's very new and we mess up a line, if we do it again, the audience isn't going to laugh that much. So suddenly it looks like the show is terrible for people watching on television. So he said, all right, we'll layer in the laughs. I'll press buttons on a key and laughs will play. So this allowed TV to become more like the movies in a way, because now you could shoot first and layer in the laughs after. But to exactly your point, once television became cinematic, where's the laugh track in movies? It doesn't exist. So suddenly this thing that allowed TV to become cinematic actually seemed anachronistic once television was purely cinematic, once it was television's equal. And now as a result, the last time a comedy won the Emmy for Best Comedy with a laugh track was 2005, Everybody Loves Raymond. So for the last decade, we've been living in a laugh trackless a world of premium comedy. Anyway, I don't know. I didn't see where the mic was, but any? Do we have any first takers for questions?
Yeah, back there.
A lot of what you've been talking about tonight might be summarized as follow the dopamine. It's a kind of behavioral economics, neuroscientific kind of view of like why we are the way we are. What does that maybe imply for the future in your view? Are you fundamentally optimistic about that, or more pessimistic in that, the dopamine will lead us in optimistic or, maybe less than places?
I was really optimistic, weirdly, until about 3 weeks ago. I don't know.
A month exactly?
Something happened. 4 weeks ago, I guess it is. Actually, it's interesting. There is a kind of a dopamine story here. Surprise and the surprise instinct, as I talk about in the book. The dopamine. One of the things that dopamine regulates is our interest in unpredictable stimuli. Right, when we are predicting the world is going to behave a certain way, and the world confounds that expectation. We are wired to pay attention to it, which has obvious kind of evolutionary advantages. And so what humans have done over time is, engineer ever more elaborate environments to trigger that response, particularly in a safe environment, right? There's, a tiger lunging out of the jungle to eat you is surprising, but perhaps not something one would want to do on a regular basis. Whereas an interesting, surprising minor chord shift when you thought it was going to the major is also surprising, but not quite as threatening. So there is part of that story, but it is also, I think, really important to say that a lot of the history of delight is about pushing the boundaries of our kind of innate instincts. There's a big chapter in the book about the history of spices, right? Which we on some level are purely frivolous tastes and flavors that don't actually add any nutritious value, and yet the world has been incredibly shaped by the spice trade, made the global economy in the first place. And something like pepper, which for many centuries was more valuable than gold, measured by the pound, when we taste pepper on the tongue, particularly chili peppers and things like that, what is literally happening to our tongue is that there are biochemical alarms on the surface of our tongue that are sending a signal to our brain saying that your tongue is on fire. I mean, it is, when we say that spicy food is hot, it is literally, it's not a metaphor. It's the same sensor that's saying that there is some flame attached to your tongue. You should really stop eating this thing. And yet, while that is something that evolution has been crafting for millennia, for good reason, as humans, as part of cultural systems, we have developed the ability to override that alarm and actually turn that pain into a kind of pleasure and expand the kind of boundaries of what we find acceptable or find pleasurable. And so there is an interesting mix of our kind of innate wiring and this drive to push those innate drives into surprising places and to make connections or expand the boundaries of what pleasure actually can be. And so it's not just about that kind of almost animal instinct.
The interesting thing about the pepper metaphor is that I feel like if we were hunter-gatherers and you went around like looking for food to eat and you just really wanted a berry or something or a grain and you put a pepper in your mouth, you'd be like, oh God, this is going to kill me. But when it's on like a Chipotle chicken sandwich, you're like, what a lovely little kick,
right.
And so it's sort of like a gastronomic thriller where like you go to the movies to see a scary movie, not because you want to think you're going to die. If you wanted to think you're going to die, people would just buy tickets in droves to go to like Syria, unfortunately, or like Iraq. Like they'd be like, great, I want to like feel like I'm going to die. No, a movie theater is where you go to feel like you're on a narrative roller coaster, but know you're going to be safe in the end, and the movie theater isn't going to literally stab you in the heart. And so it's sort of the same with eating pepper on a sandwich. What I was going to say directly to the answer to your question was, I'm a cultural optimist. I think that there's lots of people who say, oh, everything new makes music worse and movies worse and TV worse. I'm a cultural optimist. I don't think that's true. But I am a political pessimist. I think there's lots of things that have nothing to do with culture, like the Electoral College and the distribution of votes in America, that just make the sort of near-term and sort of medium-term future of politics one to be a little bit despondent about. But an interesting interesting follow-up, I guess, would be, well, don't culture and politics interact? So are you a pessimist on, say, journalism and the future of media? To which I would say there's obviously lots of terrible things right now with fake news and Russian propaganda on Facebook and things like that. One of my last chapters in my book is about George Gallup, synonymous with Gallup polling. Before he was synonymous with political polling and surveys, he was a dissertation student at the University of Iowa studying newspapers. And he was the first person to think of the idea, if you want to know what people are reading in the newspaper, don't ask them, go watch them. Literally watch them read the newspaper. If any of you are familiar with Chartbeat, it was like sort of human Chartbeat. He found that people who said they read the front page almost never did. People who said they followed local news almost never did. The most popular thing for men to read was the political cartoon by J.H. Darling, and the most popular thing for women to read was the fashion photograph, which is kind of like reading, but neither of those are reading. They're both just images. So basically, we were Facebook readers before Facebook existed. And unfortunately, I think the problem is not technological, but sort of it's at the species level. And I don't know if that's optimism or pessimism, but it's sort of like, there we are.
Other questions?
Other questions? We got one right here.
Okay.
On that note, how optimistic are you of the digital age and AI? And I don't know if you guys are familiar with Black Mirror, so do you see a future where it could go to the point of destruction? And are you wary of it?
Yeah, I mean, well, this whole superintelligence debate about what happens when machines are so smart that we can't understand them, and on some level they exceed both our intelligence and our ability to make sense of where their intelligence is coming from. And I'm personally not smart enough to make an accurate kind of assessment of whether that is likely and whether it will happen. But the only thing I would say, I wrote a little piece about this about 6 months ago, and it's in another book that I'm working on right now. What is encouraging, I guess, is that there is a very active, very articulate, passionate debate happening right now about that threat, and it's happening in the form of television shows, and it's happening in the form of philosophers and technologists, Elon Musk and Bill Gates, debating all these issues. Books have been written, and what we're doing collectively is projecting forward probably at least 50 years. Some people may disagree on the timing here, but something in the order of 50 years, and saying we don't face this problem right now as a species, but we believe, based on our understanding of the past, based on current technological trends and our sense of where things are headed, we believe that there will be an important problem we will face as a species in about 50 years. And so we should really start thinking about what to do now so that we can anticipate that problem, maybe swerve around it somehow, or at least buttress ourselves when we confront that problem in 50 years. And that is a very high-order form of thinking. The human species has never really done that. We've anticipated cyclical problems, like 100-year storms and 100-year floods and things like that. But we've never, in a sense, anticipated emergent problems that are going to show up in 50 years that do not exist now.
Like the Industrial Revolution. Like it happens once, maybe twice in history.
That's exactly right. The analogy I would use, what we're trying to do now, and it's hard to do, we're trying to do it with climate change basically on the same level, although we have more direct evidence that it is actually happening. What we're trying to do now is a bit like the kind of inventors of industrialization that we were talking about before, sitting there in 1750 and going, well, this technology is going to be great. We're going to make a lot of cheap cotton. That's going to be fantastic. But we also seem to be outputting carbon into the atmosphere. So it'd be really good if we could figure out a better way to do this so that we don't run into a problem 200 years from now. Nobody thought that in 1750. That wasn't even imaginable as a thought in 1750. Whereas now we have the ability to at least make those conceptual projections forward. And that itself is a kind of progress. Whether it's enough to keep us from those robot overlords in 50 years, I don't know the answer to that, but at least there is something that we can point to that is a kind of progress.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I don't have a lot to add, but I do think that in an interesting way, based on exactly what Steven said and his brief description to me of his book, maybe I'm borrowing from it, that it's always nice to simulate decisions, simulate long-term decisions. You go on lots of dates with lots of different people to simulate essentially, how do I find a mate? Well, I go on lots of dates and I figure it out. In a way, art is a simulation of the future. Dystopic art is a simulation of the possibility of a dystopic future. And so, in a way, one order chaos is no one can predict what's going to happen, and nothing we say or do can change it, like an asteroid. But a second order of chaos is we can't predict the future exactly, but all attempts to predict the future actually might change it. So in a weird way, watching her and watching Black Mirror inflects how technologists think about the upsides and downsides of their work. I don't know whether they watch the Black Mirror episode, my favorite, where the couple that breaks up because the guy's recording everything and he steals the thing from the woman. I don't know. You know it.
Spoiler alert.
That's right. Great show. But due to predictability, people enjoy predictability. So actually knowing the end, there are studies that suggest knowing the end of a story actually make it more enjoyable. You focus on the details. So it's possible that a technologist looks at that and is like, wow, what an awesome idea. I'll build that. And then another person might watch it and be like, wow, that's horrifying. I'll never build it. And so it's so hard to predict. But I actually do think that these pieces of art do change the future because the people building the future watch them.
I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah. Besides music, another strand in Wonderland that struck me was games.
Yeah.
And the idea of games as a metaphor, another place where both familiarity and surprise are important. And I just wonder if you could say anything about where we are now with gaming and whether that's something we should be paying attention to in terms of where we're going as a culture.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up, Michael. Yeah, there's a whole long riff about this game that I played this summer actually with my 15-year-old son, and the game Space War, which was the first true video game. There were early kind of checkers on that people could play, but Space War basically was a prototype of Asteroids. It became Asteroids about 10 years later, slightly different, but it was developed in 1961, and this game was the creation of these kind of hackers at MIT who got really for the first time at MIT a big computer. It was called a mini computer, even though this thing was the size of like a giant closet. And it had a monitor, and so they were really excited about what they should do with this monitor, and they decided to create this space game. And that game became arguably one of the most influential pieces of software written in the 1960s. It was one of the first kind of open source software projects where people contributed freely to this thing, advanced it in all these different ways. Kind of major interface conventions like having an avatar on the screen were kind of pioneered by Space War, having controllers like joysticks controlling it. So it was really not just about the game, although it's important because video gaming is now a massive industry, but it was also advancing kind of serious software at the same time. And Stuart Brand in the early 70s saw people playing Space War, and it triggered this insight in his head. He said, computers are actually going to be not just tools used by the military or big business. It's going to become much more intimate. And he coined the expression personal computer, inspired by what he had seen watching people interacting with Space War. So that game was really a glimpse of what was coming to kind of mainstream society. What people were doing for fun in these weird computer labs was actually this kind of vision. And he wrote this, Stuart Brand is great, he wrote this amazing cover story not cover story, but a big article for Rolling Stone. And the first line was, computers are coming to the people. And the second line was, that's the best news since psychedelics, because it was 1972, and that's the way people wrote it in 1972. But so part of the argument in Wonderland is that when you look at people playing, it's often a sign of more serious changes, a way of predicting the future in a sense. And I think we saw that this summer with Pokemon Go, right? I mean, that was really the first indication of a real augmented reality at work at scale, where people are walking around the world looking at screens, where they're projecting something in front of the real world that is imaginary or some kind of meta information about the real world, but they're moving through real space, kind of structured by this kind of virtual supplementary layer on reality, and it happened to be chasing imaginary monsters. But in 10 years, I think we'll look back and say, oh, that thing that now is mainstream and part of our lives every day in a much more kind of serious way began with that kind of child's play on the screens of Pokemon Go.
I don't know if this is the answer to this answer takes your question but in my day job at The Atlantic, I write much more about macroeconomics than I do about culture. And I wrote a cover story for the magazine last year called World Without Work, which is about...
Totally great piece. People should check it out.
Which is about the threat of technology to employment. And already we see that there are lots of prime age, that is of working age, about between 25 and 54, men who have dropped out of the economy, and we aren't exactly sure why, but there is some evidence that they are not looking for work, not dating, not cleaning up the house. They're spending a lot of their time watching television and playing video games. That sounds dispiriting, but there's a thin silver lining, which is that in life satisfaction studies, these young men who do not have a job and do not have income and are completely detached from the thing that we think provides meaning in life, playing video games makes them happier. They're actually happier than this cohort was 20 years ago, which is like completely shocking to me, and this is going to be continuously studied, so the results might change, but let's take seriously these results. Let's take seriously the possibility that the growth of automation and technology in self-driving cars and self-driving trucks and Amazon Go shops, where you walk in and location data allows you to just take items off the shelf, and you don't need any cashier, retail salesperson, which are, by the way, cashier, retail salesperson, the most common occupations in America. Let's say a lot of these jobs go away. What are people going to do? Well, maybe they'll play video games. Certainly 50 years ago, when Stuart Brand was, or 40 years ago, whatever, when Stuart Brand was writing the Rolling Stone article, people might have been completely despondent about the idea that working age men were going to drop out of the labor force and play video games. But with due respect to my dopamine friend in the middle/back, if video games give people more meaning and more happiness and more community, albeit virtual, than being a cashier or retail salesperson or a personal care aide, then who am I as an economic writer to tisk and niche and say that they shouldn't do that? So I think that Steven's written for the Times Magazine about the future of virtual reality, and how, as is one of my theses, that the future of media is always a refrain of the past. It'll be very interesting to see how that development interacts with the secular economic development of a growing cohort of non-working young men and women who might turn to entertainment for the meaning that used to be provided by labor.
What's great about Derek's piece in The Atlantic was traditionally the debate has been framed between the machines are coming to take our jobs and this is terrible, or no, the threat is overrated, the machines aren't going to take it, people are going to invent new jobs. That's always what's happened. And what Derek introduced, based on some other work too, was this third possibility: the machines are going to take our jobs, and we might want to celebrate that. That might actually be an opening. We have to redesign a lot of institutions in society. This is where the drive for universal basic income is coming from. But potentially, it might be a good thing in the long run if we can pull it off. And I think that third part of the argument is something we're going to hear more and more over the next 10 or 20 years.
Yeah, I agree.
So maybe one or two more questions?
Thanks. I'm wondering about one of the proposed kind of macroeconomics solutions is Jaron Lanier's micropayments of we're producing all this data constantly, and obviously the tech giants are benefiting from it and improving their algorithms. I'm wondering if you have a perspective on micropayments as a possible solution. Also, there's some critique of universal basic income in that it may, in fact, just cover up social cultural wounds, rather than addressing any kind of real communal impact or cultural impact, allowing accumulated debt in underrepresented communities to be leveraged and revalued into equity. So I'm wondering, one of the other proposals is also about kind of a job guarantee, where people can actually propose the kind of work, almost like independent study on the university level, but that would come from some kind of Commonwealth funding pool. It's kind of a long ways off, especially in the current political climate. But these kinds of options, these economic options of micropayments and job guarantees and universal basic income.
Yeah, I'm gonna. Actually, I think I can answer that with a story about culture, which is that one of my favorite studies that I found for the book is the study where they showed a bunch of people Cubist paintings by Picasso and others. And when they first asked people, "Do you like these paintings?" people were like, "No, not really. This is not really good. This is not very good." And then what they did is they showed the same group of people the same paintings, but they added detail about maybe a clue about what the painting was about, or a detail about the painter's life. And suddenly their appreciation for these paintings went through the roof, because it was like these paintings, which were obscure and weird and had their backs turned, were suddenly like a friend in a crowded room that like turned around and like extended their hand. And the theory, the coinage for why this happens and what this is, from Claudia Muth, is called the aesthetic aha. That we have an aesthetic aha moment when what we are dealing with is disfluency, difficulty of thinking, I'm confused, it's strange, I'm scared, it's weird, I don't like it, followed by a realization, fluency, a moment where the sun is shining through the clouds and you're like, I get it. There's an element of it that's familiar and I get it. Art does this. Art, I think, like one of maybe the more controversial theories of the book is that this is what art is for. Art is in many ways for delivering aha moments, for giving people these moments of meaning that challenge and then give a little bit. Maybe not give all, right? People sometimes like a little bit of mystery, but that challenge and then release and challenge and release. All art does this. Music does this. Stories do it. Art does it. So does work. But a check doesn't. Income alone doesn't give meaning. And my concern about universal basic income is precisely that it has taken what work represents now, which is community and income and meaning, and only takes a single strand from it, the income, and leaves the other two strands alone. And so where does meaning come from? Where does community come from? Maybe it comes from video games, but I don't like video games. And that suggests to me that there's probably other people that don't really like video games. And so where are they going to get their meaning? Are they going to make art? Are they going to paint, make music? Are we going to have a flourishing of artisanal shops like we had, in sort of colonial America? Paul Revere was a silversmith. Maybe, but that's the challenge. Not how do you replace the money. We're 3 times richer than we were in the 1980s, and we were plenty rich under Reagan. The question is, how do you replace meaning? And maybe art plays a role, but universal basic income doesn't cover it.
Hi, I'm wondering if you can talk about the difference between consumption play and sort of active innovation play, sort of like the difference between children playing a video game that already exists versus making up their own. So you talk about video games, and it seems like some of that is a passive sort of consumption-based entertainment versus the people who create the games themselves. So at what point do the two sort of, what does one transform to the other?
Yeah, it's a great distinction. So I think about that a lot as a parent, actually, right? We have 3 boys who were 2 of whom are teenagers, and so they have gotten wind of the idea that Dad wrote this book celebrating video games 10 years ago, and we've burned all the copies in the house, but somehow they still found out about it. And so, obviously I'm open to the idea that they're rewarding interesting things going on, but what we've tried to do is really kind of follow that distinction and say, look, the question is not really the traditional one of like play educational games versus, violent games or something like that, but rather how much kind of creative energy is going into the imaginary world of this game, and how much kind of problem solving are you doing in the game, and how much control do you have over the game world, and how much can you kind of reinvent the rules of the game world. And I think most of us who've wrestled with this and thought about this and experienced this with ourselves or with our kids would have accepted at this point that Minecraft is a great example of a game where there's a lot of creativity going on and they are kind of building a world. But even something like Grand Theft Auto, there is a lot of ingenious stuff that's happening inside of that world. And so while we are, begrudgingly kind of doing this, we recognize something interesting is happening in that space, as opposed to Candy Crush or something like that, where you aren't really inventing the rules as you go. But that's another. I mean, quoting Stuart Brand again, when I was interviewing him about Space War, he had this beautiful observation. He said, the thing about kids, when they're left to their own, when they're young, they obviously have a tremendous appetite for play, and play, species-wise, is an important part of our developmental process and of other advanced mammals. It's one of the things that's defining about us. But one of the things is, if you watch kids playing, a big part of that work is inventing the rules of the game you're playing. And what society ends up doing when Little League arrives is to say, all that inventing of the rules, no, you can't do that anymore. There are 3 strikes. This is how it works. There's 4 balls, and these are the rules that Abner Doubleday set down 150 years ago, and you can't mess with them. And so that the rule creating kind of side of our imagination gets kind of wiped out, and you get these kind of structured games. And that's why I think one of the great things you can do, both I think in a classroom and as a parent, is designing games. Like I've been designing board games with my 10-year-old, and the activity of designing a game, whether it's it could be a video game too, but a board game is kind of lovely because you're physically building it. It's an amazingly rich kind of cognitive process, right? You come up with the structure of it, you come up with the theme of it, you come up with the basic rules, you come up with the chance mechanism, you figure out all this stuff, and you make a prediction about what that game is going to be like when you play it. And then you sit down to play it, and your prediction is totally wrong. And the game is incredibly boring. Somebody wins after 3 minutes, or everybody gets stuck on one side of the board and can't get out. And so then you revise that hypothesis based on the experience of playing the game, and you jigger with it a little bit, and you come up with a second version. It's the scientific method, basically. And an 8-year-old will do it all day long because it's in that form of a game. It's just this kind of magical process. So that kind of creativity, under the umbrella of play, I think is something that schools should be doing more of. Game design as a kind of an educational device, I think, is really a powerful resource.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the question. Thank you all very much for sitting through us.
I think Rufus